bedankt für uw freundliche uitnodiging een lezing te geven. Dit zijn de laatste woorden in het Nederlands die ik zal proberen te spreken. Special, nein, das geht auf Englisch weiter. Special thanks to Sarah for that lovely introduction, and to the splendid university for the possibility to be here for several days in this lovely city, and especially, of course, to the Austria Foundation for setting up this lovely center, which has enabled this talk, was the Habsburg Empire and Empire. I should also thank the American Academy in Berlin, which has permitted me to have a number of months of undisturbed study time in order to think about this and related matters. So, Habsburg Empire, Habsburg monarchy. We usually call the monarchy an empire. There are many books calling the Habsburg monarchy an empire, but technically, specialists will know, the monarchy never was an empire. This is a word that translates only roughly into the German word Reich. The closest the Habsburgs came to using imperial language to describe their realm came in 1804, when they proclaimed their realm a Kaisertum, an emperor state. But in 1867, they downgraded it to the Austro-Hungarian double monarchy. Other major European land powers, the French, the Russian, the German, had no such hesitation and proudly called themselves empires. The word Kaisertum, adopted in 1804, tells us that the Habsburg leaders valued the imperial title, but why did they not match it with a corresponding geographic reality? Why was there not a Reich to correspond to the Kaisertum? How could an emperor not preside over an empire? In what follows, I'm going to argue, try to convince you that there's more at stake than merely a semantic quibble, a quarrel about words. What the Habsburg Empire was called and what people understood it to be mattered for millions of people, because how it was referred to and how it referred to itself reflected a basic security or insecurity of identity. States that are not secure about their identity but try to live up to names that their basic substance does not justify are dangerous, perhaps unstable states that threaten the peace and the livelihood of their environments. So, as you'll note, I'm especially interested in this word Reich, the German word Reich, a powerful concept which governed Germans' political thinking for centuries, whose exact meaning is poorly reflected in the English word empire. The resonance of the word Reich in the German cultural world is profound, can be unsettling. And Austria's leaders in the early 19th century worried what they would signal by using that word, Reich, to describe their state. So where does this word come from? What's the origin of the word Reich? We actually know, thanks to philologists, pretty exactly that it comes from a Celtic word, actually, not a Romance word as you might expect, but a Celtic word that meant realm, an area ruled by a king or some other potentate. We see traces of this general meaning in proper names like Heinrich. Heinrich simply means ruler, Rich, of the home, Hein. There's also the word Königreich, a realm ruled by a king, as in Königreich England. Closer to our topic, of course, is Österreich, Austria, which was designated as an eastern march of Bavaria, the first recorded use of which dates from 966. In the modern period, Reich continued to have this possibility of meaning something less than empire. For example, German speakers of the late 18th century applied Ungarisches Reich to Hungary and Polnisches Reich to Poland. Yet, for me more importantly, Reich also came to signify something grander, a realm above kingdoms, a universal empire in the tradition of Rome. From the 12th century onwards, the words Heiliges Römisches Reich, Holy Roman Empire, carried transcendent overtones missing from the British or the French or perhaps the Dutch variants of empire, signaling a divine appointment, far above a single king's divine right. Thus, when people said simply Das Reich in the year 1800, they meant precisely that very ancient structure, universal, supposedly going back to Charlemagne and much earlier. involving much of Italy, most German areas, in fact, virtually all German areas, parts of what became France, Burgundy, for example, all of Czechia, Bohemia, parts of the Low Countries, as you're well aware, parts of Slovenia and parts of Poland, and I'm still missing some of what went into that old empire. Yet over time, the Old Reich, as you'll know, politically fell far short of what people nowadays consider imperial rule. I had a long argument last year with a historian in Jena telling me that it couldn't be called a Reich at all. The Old Reich was not an empire. From the 13th, according to him, from the 13th century, emperors ceded rights to vassals so that by the 18th century, the components of the Holy Roman Empire, including city-states, principalities, archbishoprics, and a few kingdoms, lived free from direct imperial influence. In 1806, the Holy Roman Empire ceased to exist, but its evocative power, its power to enlighten imaginations grew. Germans, and I include, by the way, when I say Germans, I include Austrians in that term. Germans of succeeding generations recalled not so much the dysfunctional entity of recent times, but the supposed glory of the medieval Reich. The Austrian scholar Julius Ficker captured some of this magical appeal in lectures given in Innsbruck in 1861. When thinking of Reich, he said, we recall powerfully ruling empires at the head of a united nation, filled with the proud feeling of their supremacy, dominating neighboring peoples, Nachbarvölker, determining the fate of this part of the world. A huge part of the world, I might add. In the 19th century, the Habsburg state had no choice but to connect to that ancient tradition as it vied to remain relevant in German and European politics. In what follows, I begin by tracing the struggles of top officials, especially Chief Minister Prince Clemens Lothar von Metternich, to use or to avoid using this powerful word when plotting the future of Austria. The word Reich prompted, even seduced statesmen into thinking in grand, often bombastic terms, and Metternich, the conservative, employed it with great care. Recalling and attempting to revive the past, after all, might have revolutionary implications. What I mean is that bringing back the past, as the past existed before 1789, would disrupt the new peace order that Metternich and others crafted and protected after 1815. But Metternich, too, would eventually prove powerless to resist this word's mass appeal. What follows will not simply be the story of elites, of Metternich and his friends. Even if the Habsburgs did not officially designate their realm a Reich, their subjects colloquially often used that word to describe it, especially from the 1870s. So somehow Reich had a hold on people's imaginations that could not be suppressed. But what did they mean? This is late in the century. In the work of many outstanding students of Central Europe's past, empire, when applied to the Habsburg monarchy, and you may know this if you've read the work of Peter Judson, probably the most recent historian of the Habsburg Empire, the word empire connotes, in his work, Peter's work, and other outstanding specialists' work, a positive force, a force that kept peace among quarreling nationalities, promoting order and progress in a huge space over a long period. Yet in other areas of the globe, if you think beyond Central Europe, the claim that an empire might accomplish something worthwhile would be very unusual. The efforts of France or Great Britain or the Netherlands to dispense civilization upon Algeria, India, or Indonesia, for instance, have generated heated criticism. These and other empires, it is argued, exploited and often destroyed the peoples they ruled. To connect the Habsburg lands to that broader story, I will consider those who were on the receiving end of Habsburg imperialism, subjects who felt that Austrian rule was ruled by a foreigner set against their aspirations to self-government. I am thinking primarily of Czechs, Poles, and Hungarians, but there were others who resented the Habsburg monarchy's pretensions to spread a higher civilization to them and felt that Vienna was a colonial master. No doubt these groups of citizens respected imperial authority. They were loyal subjects and then citizens. But the word empire provoked an intuition among them that we find among subjects of colonial rule elsewhere, namely that rule by a foreigner cannot be just. When they were free to speak, Austria's subjects discovered they had stories about themselves that differed from the stories told by their imperial masters. They had their own feast days, their own heroes, their own times of mourning. Czechs or Hungarians recalled glorious feats of the Habsburg Empire, like, for example, the Battle of White Mountain in 1618, as their own national tragedies. The Habsburgs' problems with empire, now I'm going to shift to the main body of my remarks. The Habsburg problems with empire, the specific problem of Reich, began with the Corsican who thought of himself as a new Charlemagne. In May 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. He actually put the crown on his own head and proceeded to establish a Rhine Confederation, Rheinbund. Looking aside, as major collaborators in this French-made state, the Rheinbund, like Bavaria, Württemberg, or Hanover, helped themselves to dozens of free cities and bishoprics, some of which you can see on this map. The Old Reich was disappearing before everyone else's eyes in the early 19th century, and Napoleon finally said it must be disbanded. Now, for Austria's Emperor Francis II, this demand of Napoleon constituted a threat. The Habsburg family had supplied Roman emperors, Römische Kaiser, since the 13th century, and if the Holy Empire were disbanded, the Habsburg ruler would simply be King of Hungary and Bohemia, subordinate to Napoleon and maybe even his vassal. And so, in an act of dubious legality, Francis crowned himself Emperor, Kaiser of Austria in August of 1804. On the background of global history, this was an odd way of founding an empire. His own self-crowning, was not aggressive, and the aspiration was not imperial. There was no ambition to grow and be boundless, which we usually think of as key aspects of empire. Empires do not recognize limits to their own growth. That is what people nowadays think an empire is. For Austria, becoming an empire, Kaisertum, Kaiserstaat, was a step taken in fear. The point was more to seem imperial than to be imperial. And as mentioned, the word used was not Reich, but Kaisertum. Thus, it was an entity where the focus was the glory of the potentate and not rule of space. In 1806, the Old Reich, the old Holy Roman Empire, was finally dissolved at Napoleon's prompting, and now a vacuum of legitimacy opened in Central Europe, in a vast space. For the first time in many centuries, there was no German state. A newly emergent German national movement felt, as did many average Germans, that an organizing entity, some kind of statehood, was desperately needed to unite and defend the German nation. And here I'm including Austria, by the way, from a repetition of something like French occupation, which had lasted some 2 decades with devastating effects for a German population. Germans assumed that this German state would be not just a nation state, but a Reich. Of this basic concept, there was no doubt actually until 1945. The Habsburg state could not ignore this new German nationalism of the early 19th century because it claimed to be the leading force in Germany, which, again, I'll remind you, in those days included not just Austria, but also Bohemia. Okay, so you'll notice at the center of this map is Königreich Böhmen. Virtually every German thought of Königreich Böhmen, today's Czechia, as being not just in Germany, but centrally inside of Germany, okay, till 1945. Therefore, in succeeding decades, we see a movement away from diffidence and toward determination in employing the word Reich. This was a time, by the way, when Germany itself was organized in a weak structure, no longer the Holy Roman Empire, but something called, as I mentioned earlier, the German Confederation, the Deutsche Bund. This was a successor to the Holy Roman Empire that reduced the number of sovereign entities from over 1,000 to fewer than 100, greatly simplifying the map, but still leaving it quite complex, as you can see. But still at the center of this is Königreich Böhmen. Prince Metternich, the Austrian Minister of State from 1809, presided over a shift in Austria in understandings of the word Reich from his early days in office. When the Habsburg state hardly uttered the word Reich to the 1840s, when he began embracing the term, still with great care. This evolution in the use of this word in Austria began in a hushed way in the chambers of the Austrian bureaucracy. In 1812, a memo went out from Vienna telling officials that it was possible to use the words unser Reich, our empire, to describe the Habsburg lands, but chiefly for appearance's sake. The alternative historical term Erbstaaten, hereditary states seemed weak, not wrong, but more or less embarrassing. Mehr oder minder kompromittierend. And so Metternich appended a notation to this order banning all discussion of it. The order was to be communicated by way of quiet intimation, mittelst einer stillen Intimation. Such was the diffident entrance of the Austrian Reich into world history, hardly registered even by some in its own top bureaucracy. Arguably, one can sympathize with the government. It arguably feared bold use of the word Reich because of what it might suggest in commitment to creating a unified German empire and uncorking the bottle of German nationalism, something Metternich feared as disruptive of the new order painfully regained in Europe after Napoleon's fall. Openness to nationalism would also have signaled some openness to popular sovereignty, something that Metternich also despised. Still, in published materials, we note a gradual acceptance of the words Austrian Reich from a handful of cases in the 1820s to a modest proliferation by the 1840s. Metternich adopted the word in order to counterbalance challenges to Austria's status in Europe. In the 1840s, Prussian King Frederick William II had been replaced by the more vigorous Frederick William III had been replaced by the more vigorous Frederick William IV, thus reviving Austro-Prussian dualism that had tested the old empire. An assertive France was hinting at designs on territory in the German Rhineland. And national movements in Italy, Hungary, and Germany were growing rather than subsiding. The Austrian response could not be simple suppression. It had to project a positive image and make the Habsburg state seem a relevant force within and beyond the old empire space. But if Metternich began employing the word Reich in the 1840s, he did so in a conservative way. Austria was to become a cohesive, culturally German state whose radiant power would make it seem relevant in Germany and beyond. As noted, a vital part of Austrian identity was seem to be the leading state in Germany, more powerful than Prussia. In July 1847, Metternich told the Prussian ambassador as follows: Austria is an empire, a Reich, which includes under its rule peoples of differing nationality. But as a Reich, it has only one nationality. Austria is German, German by virtue of its history, by virtue of the core of its provinces, by virtue of its civilization. That same month, July 1847, Metternich dilated upon the challenges to German rule in multinational Austria to the Habsburg representative to St. Petersburg. Within our Reich, he said, there were 4 types of Slavism, so Slavic groups, of which the Polish was the most dangerous. This evil, he said, had to be fought in various ways. The primary way to fight Polonism, as he called it, was to strengthen the monarchy's Germans. After the 1846 revolution in Galicia, so this is the Austrian-controlled part of southern Poland, Metternich had written an internal memorandum. Galicia, and I will quote, Galicia needs promotion of the German element. By this promotion, I do not mean what might easily be considered Germanization. He was too clever for that. A people, a Volksstamm, can be transformed into another people only with the assistance of time, a very long time. The promotion of the German element should be pursued by maintaining it and its influence with all possible means. That is, civilization in the real meaning of the word. These means include promoting the acquisition of property by Germans, raising up the German middle class, helping spread the German language in schools and other ways as well. Metternich added that in no Reich was nationality as a principle, so the idea of nationality, more honored in the Austrian Kaiserreich, right? So that was his public pronouncement, but behind that was that desire for Germanization. He said that nationality was honored because before him, the actual substance of nationality was negligible. Polonism, he wrote, is just a formula, a wording, behind which stands revolution in its most extreme form. Like today's constructivist school of nationalism studies, if you're familiar with this, Metternich thus believed that nationality and culture were easily malleable. A clever statesman thus might make nations, might manufacture them by his own will. In 1815, Metternich had put forth a plan for dividing the monarchy into 6 zones, fostering a regional identity in each, while promoting the German element in all. Poles in Galicia, for example, were supposed to forget that they were Poles and become Galicians, and their elites would then be gradually Germanized. Elsewhere, he fostered what I would call a soft denationalization, supporting museums and primary schools in Czech, making aid available to Slavic scholars throughout the monarchy, but remaining confident that German civilization would ultimately prevail and gradually displace Czech, Polish, and the South Slavic languages. This mixing of pragmatism and opportunism terrified advocates of Slavic peoples who knew that slow assimilation had led to the disappearance of Slavs further north in Lusatia, south of Berlin, and also in Silesia, further to the east and elsewhere. In retrospect, we thus see a further peculiarity of Austrian imperialism beyond its conservatism. Unlike ideals types of empire that are common today among scholars, the Habsburg state was not satisfied with difference, but produced energies that would seek homogeneity, though admittedly never as radically or forcefully as other European land empires, especially the Russian. Younger Austrian imperialists were bolder than Metternich in the 1840s, wanting their state to figure at the head of a united Germany, but also much more. In one of the most influential books to appear in these years, the so-called Vormärz, Austria and its Future of 1847, the liberal Victor von Adrian Warburg wrote that the Vienna settlement of 1815 could not last forever, and Austria had to absorb and make useful the forces of the age. Indeed, it had to dominate nationalities and occupy and control a huge space, from the Rhine to the Black Sea, reminiscent of the old empire, only much grander. A prime consideration was Austria's connection to two European regions, Germany in the west and the Danube Valley in the east. To the former, Austria was bound by 2,000 years of brotherhood, and to the latter by what he called trade interests. Adrian Warburg did not ask about the desires of the people involved, which were literally dozens of peoples. Please note, this man was not a conservative. Unlike Metternich, he was a liberal who believed Austria should lead Germany to unity against the monarchical principle. Wanted to lead Germany and Austria into the modern age, get people used to the idea that their interests differed from those of princes, loosening the bonds, as he wrote, of dependence and deference between the people and its princes. However, you will note that in this imperial civilizing mission, the liberal Adrian Warburg was united with the conservative Metternich. So just months after these lines were printed, revolution broke out across Europe, and Metternich fled to England. Now the word Reich, burst out of hibernation. It was free across Europe to speak openly. Not only useful, but necessary for Germans imagining the future of Central Europe. A number of variants of Reich were suddenly on the table, and the future seemed open. This is March of 1848. The most popular was the liberal, this is also the best known version, was the liberal German one, which aimed to include Germans in a constitutional monarchy called Deutsches Reich, connecting to plans that had emerged 3 decades earlier in the wars of liberation among the German national movement. The freshly elected German parliament in Frankfurt am Main divided, however, over whether Austria could belong. Ultimately, it voted in bare majority in favor of Austria being part of the new German Empire. The delegates in Frankfurt did not, however, include Austria's non-German lands in their imagined German Reich. They left out Hungary. And thus, without saying so, they were opting to destroy the Habsburg monarchy. So not surprisingly, Austria's rulers rejected this plan coming from Frankfurt, and it became null and void in any case in April of 1849, when the Prussian king refused the crown offered to him by the parliament at Frankfurt. However, this is a second sort of idea. In March of 1849, the Austrian minister-president, Prince Felix von Schwarzenberg, had put forth a counter-proposal at Frankfurt, calling for a Reich that would include the German Confederation as well as the Habsburg lands, all Habsburg lands, a sort of conservative echo of the plans for the Great Reich promoted by Adrian Warburg. Known to history, if you read the literature, it's known as the 70 Millionen Reich, or the Empire of 70 Millions. Such a Reich clearly represented a quantum advance over the decades in Austria's willingness, this is the leading Austrian statesman, to embrace an Austrian mission as empire. This would have been much, much more than a Kaisertum, involving claims to legitimacy in an enormous space, larger than any European state since the days of Charlemagne, save one, Russia. Schwarzenberg's hope was that Austria would absorb the German national idea and transcend it, go beyond it, and establish Austria as, in a sense, as the indeed most powerful empire on the European mainland. Yet, in contrast to the hopes of German Democrats to create an empire based in popular rule, with the Prussian king as a constitutional emperor, Schwarzenberg's plan called for a union of princes, among whom the Habsburgs would be the leader. Now to what I consider the most interesting variant of Reich III one. So, beyond Austria and Germany, 1848 was called a springtime of peoples, of many peoples. The Hungarians passed a constitution in March of 1848 that was recognized by the Habsburg crown in April. Yet from the summer of 1848, the monarchy stepped away from its obligations, ultimately triggering war across the huge multi-ethnic Hungary that lasted into 1849. Multi-ethnic Bohemia had been part of the Holy Roman Empire as well as the German Confederation. So the Frankfurt Constitution's drafters assumed it would be part of their new Germany. Within Bohemia, the Germans, who constituted about a third of the population, had loyally voted for a German state, while the majority Czechs staged a boycott, electing representatives to an Austrian Reichstag, note the name, Reichstag, meaning parliament, that met first in Vienna and then in the Bohemian city of Kremsier. Thus, Reichstag represented all of Austria outside of Hungary. This is a new democratically organized parliament for Austria. The best-known proponent of the Czech boycott of the German elections in early 1848 was the historian and statesman František Palacký. So I think I have a representation of him, if this can be resuscitated. Yes, this is Palacký, rather severe-looking elder statesman in 1848. Much more severe than the people we tend to associate with Prague. So Palacký, in April 48, he was invited to take part in the deliberations to create democratic Germany, to participate in the Frankfurt Assembly. He rejected this invitation, saying that he was a Bohemian of Slavic origin. Yet Palacký worried that by taking Austria's Germans into a greater Germany, the Frankfurt Parliament would destroy the Austrian state. As is well known, this is the best known thing about Palacký in general history books, Palacký praised Austria and its necessary place in Europe. You may have heard of this before. What is less known is that his response suffers from a mistranslation in English. What we usually read is the following. Truly, if the Austrian Empire had not already been long in existence, we would have to hurry and create it in the interests of Europe and in the interest of humanity itself. In fact, what Palacký wrote was not empire or Reich. He wrote Kaiserstadt. He did not, and he purposely refused to allude to the tradition of the Reich because he knew that Reich had been a German-dominated entity. More important, he did not share Schwarzenberg's idea of a Central European Union of Princes, a Staatenbund. Palacký's idea instead was a Völkerverein, a union of peoples, a democratic confederation. And I will quote from his letter. The southeast of Europe, along the borders of the Russian Empire, is inhabited by a large number of peoples who are distinct in heritage, language, history, and behavior. Slavs, Romanians, Magyars, Germans, not to mention Greeks, Turks, and Albanians, of which none is powerful enough to defy successfully the all-powerful neighbor in the East, for all time. They can only do this if they are united by a single and strong bond. This is, in some sense, like a European Union, long ahead of the time. And by the way, who do you think he meant by the neighbor in the East? Putting these words into the context of our time, we can appreciate a paradox. The politician who, in line with today's constructivist sensibility, believed that nationhood was just a word, and that in line with the pronouncement of Ernest Gellner, nationalists create nations and not the other way around, was the reactionary jailmaster and peace and order keeper, Prince Metternich. The prince wanted to suppress nationalism because he worried what free human beings might do if they used principles of consent to create representative institutions. That's exactly what happened in early 1848. And the politician who now seems antiquated and out of touch with our current wisdom about the malleability of nationalism was the liberal enemy of imperialism, who thought nationhood was real and based in history and language. Palacký, however, was no primordialist. He did not believe in ancient nationalities. His vision featured an evident plasticity. Slavs, for instance, might form nations in various ways. It was not written in stone. Pulaski was also not a chauvinist. His Austria had room for Germans and Turks as regional, but not imperial peoples. The important thing for him, that nationhood was the basic state building principle, and he went from there. I would say he was simply looking at the facts of that time. When people in Central Europe were permitted to imagine self-government and freedom, they did so within the framework of nations. There could, however, be a community of small nations. In fact, there had to be, with the Russian Empire looming beyond Austria's borders in the east. In the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, the Habsburg state reformed. Now moving to the next part of the talk. After 1848. Habsburg state reformed despite the neo-absolutism of the new emperor Francis Joseph. I actually have a picture of him as well. You all know what he looked like as a young man. Despite the neo-absolutism of this new emperor, dramatic advances took place in the economy and state building after 1848, throughout the 1850s. We also see much more frequent employment of the word Reich in Austrian usage, though the origins are difficult to discern. The word Reich entered official and popular usage in a backhanded and unintentional way in early 1848. As noted, for reasons that I haven't been able to discern, Austrian citizens used the word Reichstag to denote the legislature meant to give shape to a constitutional monarchy. They imagined a constitutional monarchy as their future within a kind of Reich. Why Austrians chose that precise word is not clear, but the word Reichstag was a very old one. It was a venerable term for a representative body, and it apparently appealed to people across the political spectrum, liberals as well as conservatives, because it was very old. In March 1849, Emperor Francis Joseph, at first, you may not know this, deeply hostile to any thought of constitutional rule, had dissolved the Reichstag. So he put an end to the Reichstag, but he created a new sort of advisory body. He called it a Reichsrat. This is the beginning of the Austrian Reichsrat in 1849. And the Habsburg administrators, it seems, now used to using the word Reich, began using it unhesitatingly. They began producing a legal journal, for example, called a Reichsgesetzblatt. They talked about Reichsstaatsbürgerschaft, a Reichscitizenship, and much more. With its echoes of centralization from the time of Joseph II, which Metternich had in fact warned against, Francis Joseph's neo-absolutism, so this means that he believed that he could rule by himself in the 1850s, also favored German as an efficient means of communication. And imperial bureaucrats in the 1850s decided which languages of the empire would count as Kultursprachen. The court Germanized, while those who had hoped for Czech, Hungarian, or Polish self-rule in the manner envisioned by Pulaski experienced the 1850s as a time of deep humiliation. Yet Austria's impressive state building in this decade was taking place in a competitive European environment, and it soon fell behind its rivals. France and Prussia cut the monarchy down in two wars, first in 1859, forcing the Habsburgs out of much of Italy and onto the path of grudging constitutionalism. This is the beginning, really, of Austrian representative rule after 1859, and then in 1866 with the Austrian defeat at Königgrätz, after which Prussia expelled the Habsburgs from Germany, from their Germany. Now, major claims on the term Reich shifted northward. After Prussia's victory over France in 1870, a Kaiser in Berlin, this is the first time there was ever such a thing in Berlin, presided over a mighty German Kaiserreich, with Otto von Bismarck as the Reichskanzler, the Reich Chancellor. This occurred, although millions of Germans in Austria and Bohemia and elsewhere understood that this Prussian-led state, which we now consider Germany, was a very incomplete successor to the old Reich. They felt left out and deeply aggrieved. One of these Austrian Germans, by the way, slightly later, born in 1889, was Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, in 1867, the House of Habsburg ceased being a Kaisertum and divided into the dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary, a realm with two citizenships where a basic expectation of statehood, that is, undivided sovereignty, no longer applied. Simply to maintain order, Francis Joseph had cut a deal with Hungary's political classes, which had been boycotting Habsburg institutions and refusing to pay taxes. Thus, the Hungarian elite came to control more than half of the old Kaisertum, and the Kingdom of Hungary became a virtual nation-state within the Habsburg lands. You see the green. You see the old, enormous Kingdom of Hungary in green on this map. Francis Joseph held on to the title of Kaiser. Habsburgs would never let that go. And in Vienna, a Reichsrat became housed. This was finally, indeed, a kind of parliament, in a massive neoclassic marble that you can appreciate to this day, while a Reichsgericht may do in a handsome, if unspectacular, Italianate structure just off the Ringstrasse. The monarchy's universities taught Reichsgeschichte, meaning Austrian history, and even the Reichsapfel remained among the symbols of the state's legitimacy. In a typical muddle, confirming, I would say, old Austria's gift for operating comfortably in zones of shade and nuance, people called the monarchy's two halves Reichshälfte. So that there were two halves to the Reich, but there was no whole. There was officially no Reich. Nevertheless, people became habituated to referring to two halves. However, and here comes the surprise that Peter Judson has actually keyed us into. If one listened to street conversations across the Habsburg lands, just when empire no longer existed in any terms in Austrian territory, it's no longer even a Kaisertum, one heard people calling the monarchy not simply Kaisertum, but Reich, using this very word. The expression Habsburger Reich was not unknown before 1867, but the proliferation of this word after 1870 was startling, and by the 1890s it was virtually everywhere. In part, what was going on, I think, and this requires interpretation, was a filtering down from the Habsburg administration, which, as we saw, embraced Reich early in the rule of Francis Joseph. From the early 1850s, this usage was absorbed into school books, geographies, newspapers, everywhere. But as Peter Judson has noted, people went further than that. They called the monarchy not just Das Reich or Habsburger Reich, but Unser Reich, our empire. Judson argues that Habsburg subjects were not just bystanders, but engaged with empire, actively helping co-create what it was. These subjects, seem to be missing a page. Judson calls these subjects Austro-Hungarians to emphasize their identity as imperial citizens irrespective of ethnicity. However, if one takes the view that I'm proposing, the non-imperial view, one finds that many Austrian and Hungarian citizens, especially of Slavic nationalities, did not consider themselves Austrians, let alone Hungarians. Slovaks, Serbs, Croats would never have called themselves Hungarians. Did they also say our Reich? Of special interest for me, I expect for Sarah as well, are the Czechs, who were famously enraged by not getting a deal in 1867 like that accorded to the Hungarians, and who therefore periodically boycotted politics in Vienna, really bringing the parliamentary process to a standstill. Yet, when we probe sources from the late century, the story among the Czechs turns out to be very similar. Czechs hardly used their word for our Reich, this is naši Říši, before about 1870, but after that we witness a proliferation, just as in Austria's German lands. But what did Czech speakers mean when they said our empire? In 1887, Palacký's son-in-law, František Ladislav Rieger, put forward a resolution to the Bohemian Parliament in Prague to create an institution that would show lasting reverence, or foundation, we might say, thinking of the Austrian foundation here, a foundation that would show lasting reverence for Francis Joseph, who was soon celebrating 40 years of rule. So that would have been in 1889. This proposal passed unanimously. The Bohemian Parliament was largely consisting of conservatives at this point, including Czechs. However, throughout his remarks, Rieger called the monarch not just our Kaiser, but also our king, meaning the king of Bohemia. If you'll recall, this is one of the Habsburgs' many titles, king of Bohemia. Rieger, the Czech, was therefore leveraging empire language, for the sake of the nation, the Czech kingdom. No nation, he claimed, was as loyal to the monarch as the Czech nation. So I would say that in reference to Peter Judson's argument, that Rieger here was doing more than simply engaging with empire. Rieger claimed that the Czechs' forefathers had of their own free will, as he said, given the impetus to create the Austrian Empire in good conscience and reason, and in this empire they find support and backing of other United Nations. That was why they were eternally loyal to the dynasty. And if you read the protocol, at this point it records excellent applause. Rieger said that the Czechs loved the flowering of civilization brought by our empire, and he also sympathized with what he said was the emperor's very difficult position. Despite the realm's complexity, Francis Joseph managed, by working all the time, to promote progress among all the Austrian peoples. And at this point, the protocol notes much applause and salutations among the mostly conservative delegates. So Peter Judson has called the Habsburg monarchy a liberal empire, but I think we can wonder whether that term applies here. Rieger's behavior and that of the other Czech delegates who fawned on the monarch was not liberal. Their tone was obsequious and opportunistic, reflecting the attitude not of citizens but of subjects, to whom rights had been accorded in the 1860s by the grace of a divine right sovereign. In 1848, Rieger, as a much younger man, had wanted rule of the people. He had in fact been a liberal. Rule of the people and by the people and for the people. Yet, like other Central European liberals, after 1849, his liberalism atrophied as he pursued nationalism. By 1887, Rieger had become hyper-loyal because of all the gifts he claimed the Habsburgs had showered upon the Czechs, progress and civilization. What were we before 1849, he asked. Mostly poor peasants, was his answer. Again, he subordinated the rhetoric of empire to the interests of nationalism. So here we have another paradox. As liberal democracy emerged in the early 19th century, it generated nationalism. That is, a political world where demands were raised for basic respect for nationalities and their cultures across the map, and an end to the assumption of the natural superiority of German or Hungarian culture, the two governing cultures in the Habsburg lands. Yet nationalism tethered to ultimate rule of the monarch, to Francis Joseph in this case, and by the way, this was also true in Germany at that time, could also, and I would say did, corrupt liberalism. So I'm building actually on strong arguments made in the German case by Fritz Stern and others. If you want a whiff of what a liberal spirit in this time actually felt like, you can turn to John Stuart Mill, who praised English people's love of liberty and said as follows: "In all questions between a government and an individual, the presumption in every Englishman's mind is that the government is in the wrong." The presumption in Rieger's mind was just the opposite. Yet Rieger's abject loyalty did not achieve the desired results. At his death in 1903, political equality for Czechs, this sort of federal solution that Pulaski talked about, in Bohemia remained far out of reach. This was the view, by the way, not of right-wing nationalists in 1903, but of Czech social democrats, believers in class struggle, Marxists, as internationalists as one got among Czechs or any other Central European people. Like Rieger, Czech socialists cared deeply about the substance of nationalism, namely culture and language. In contrast to the Czech mainstream, however, they only tersely eulogized Rieger. He was an outstanding figure in the mainstream politics, but not on the left. They did not spend much time eulogizing him because despite consorting with non-democratic forces, these conservatives in Bohemia, Catholics above all, and others in the monarchy's upper classes, Rieger had failed to achieve equality for Czechs. Czechs continued to suffer from an unequal voting system that favored the upper classes. One socialist author wrote, early 1900s, that for the German political class, right or left, any shack was still good enough for a Slavic school. Like Rieger, Czech socialists did not speak of our empire. Like Rieger, Czech socialists did speak of our empire. So they also embraced this idea of our empire, but they meant something different than Rieger did. For them, the empire was not eternal. In fact, they wrote, this is 1903, that the empire had entered its death throes because of the undemocratic manner in which it was governed. The most vivid evidence of this inexorable dissolution of the Habsburg monarchy was the failure of Austrian and Hungarian negotiators to agree on the monarchy's, this is a technical issue, but it's very important, dual tariffs. They met every 10 years to agree about the share that they would absorb and would pay. Thus threatening, in other words, there was no joint budget for both sides, both Reichshälften. and thus the two imperial halves were threatened with dissolution into two medium-sized powers. Yet the socialists asked if this would be such a bad thing. The point of an agreement between the two sides, Hungary and Austria, on finances, after all, was to permit Austria-Hungary to maintain its pretensions to being an empire, or more accurately, to seem to be an empire, at the cost of its peoples. In 1903, that meant funding as many warships as the imperial neighbors, the Hohenzollerns, while education, public wages, workers' insurance took a back seat. And so let the empire dissolve into two states. No problem, said the socialists. For them, the empire's political system was absolutist and not liberal. Ultimately, the Reichsrat, this is the parliament, as you know, in Vienna, which never shook its function of being a consultative body, had no decisive say in foreign policy, meaning that top officials operated in the unchecked realm of their fears, ironically, about nationalism. I write in the book that Sarah mentioned that these Habsburg elites, in fact, launched what became a world war in 1914 about obsessions over a tiny state called Serbia of about 3 million, although the Habsburg Empire was a state of more than 50 million at that time. Yet the fact, this is more positive, the fact that these socialists could produce incisive critiques about the state they were living in indeed attests to a certain liberality in Habsburg practice. Perhaps due to their faith in history, the Czech left did not despair. They believed in 1903 that Austria's future lay in democracy. They assumed that when Austria became a democracy, it would evolve into the kind of order that Pulaski had imagined. They wrote as follows: "We urgently need a parliament with a broad European perspective, into which the conviction from the lower layers of the citizenry will penetrate that linguistic equality and national federation are the only basis on which Austria's future can be built as an international federal state at the heart of Europe." Sounds a bit like, again, imagining the European Union in some ways, many decades ahead of the fact. This was to be a federal state, not an empire. They did not want to continue with the empire. Implicitly, what socialists were doing was these Czech socialists was raising the question of whether any state called an empire could be ruled by the consent of the governed. What they understood was that states that constrained liberties of self-expression, there was censorship at this point in the Habsburg Empire, whether through Czech or any other language, could not be liberal in the sense of a liberal democracy. The notion that the empire really was their empire was therefore an illusion. So I have a few concluding remarks, and then we'll proceed according to, I don't know, what the schedule of the evening holds, but hopefully also perhaps some discussion. So the eminent specialist, American-Austrian specialist Robert A. Kahn, and other authors writing on Austria in English have taken a commonsensical approach to the question of empire. They don't complicate things the way that I have for the last half hour or more. Because if you check the standardized Webster Dictionary of American English, there's little question about whether the Habsburg monarchy qualified. So the basic definition in the Webster's Dictionary of monarchy is extensive space, rule over extensive space, numerous peoples. And that's enough to qualify as an empire. However, as I've argued, when the German word Reich, empire, intrudes, the issue is trickier. And the monarchy had difficulty using that word to describe itself, especially after the Congress of Vienna. Prince Metternich and Francis Joseph worried about misunderstandings, suspecting rightly, Francis the First, not Francis Joseph, Francis the First, worried about misunderstandings, suspecting rightly that once people of their age tried to recreate the Reich, the old Reich, the supposedly glorious Reich, the consequences, ironically, of going into the past would be revolutionary for the future. This hesitance gradually receded from the 1840s. If one wanted to contest power in Central Europe, whether as monarchist or democrat, liberal or conservative, whether Prussian or Austrian, one had to invoke this word. The Austrian Kaiserreich began doing so after Metternich's departure in 1848, probably assisted by the sudden, seemingly natural emergence of the word Reichstag to describe the first popular representation in Austria. So there was something democratic about that. The Austrian state's view of empire tended to coincide with the interests and perceptions of the monarchy's German-speaking cultural elite. When German speakers used the term Das Reich or Unser Reich, they assumed a German-dominated entity with a mission to spread civilization eastward, to the people that Julius Ficker, if you'll recall, referred to as Nachbarvölker, the neighboring peoples. That had been the tradition supposedly from time immemorial, and there was no break from Joseph II and Metternich to the pan-Germanists and even Austro-Marxists, for whom a proper gymnasium was always German. As Robert Kahn tells us, the German national group could operate without difficulty as a specific entity in all geographic areas and in all fields of cultural activities, and thus the imperial idea in the Habsburg lands became almost exclusively identified with German culture. The Habsburg Empire, therefore, was not multi-ethnic in its essence, Kahn continues. Its imperial idea did not reflect the geographic, social, and political profile of the various peoples of the monarchy in terms acceptable to the nationalities who comprised the majority of its inhabitants. Thus, it is no surprise that the nationalities, meaning the Czechs, Poles, etc., considered Austrians to be foreign rulers. Slavs were on the receiving end of imperialism. The Austrian crown lands of the Habsburg monarchy were relatively tolerant. This needs to be stressed. They were relatively tolerant compared to other empires of the time. However, the basic relation was the same, of imperial rulers, here in Vienna, there in St. Petersburg or Berlin, assuming they represented a superior civilization. Therefore, calling the Czechs Austrians or the Slovaks Hungarians is like calling Poles and Ukrainians living under Tsarist rule Russians, or indeed today's Ukrainians Russians, or going further afield, like calling the Irish British. To see the non-imperial view, one has to focus on what was at stake, not the economic and material civilization that Rieger lauded, but language and culture. The point of the East European national movement, something Western writers on nationalism underrate, in my view, is that languages are specific and not interchangeable. Many words can be roughly translated or not translated at all. People of the region, Czechs, Poles, and others, have noted a double standard in how Westerners view Eastern Europe, a view we can appreciate by going just outside the borders of the old monarchy, to the lands of what would become the German state, so just outside of the old Habsburg monarchy. In April 1848, Germans went to the polls for the first time ever, first democratic experience in Germany. This happened in Bavaria, Hessen, Bohemia, Prussia, and elsewhere. It happened in Austria. Casting ballots, producing this Frankfurt parliament, hoping to create their national state. No text, no book of history describing these elections in April 1848 implies that Germans were behaving irrationally. No one says they would or should have been nationally indifferent. Germans were doing what the French had done in the 1790s. To be free human beings, wrote one Austrian 1848er, Germans had to overcome their division, their Zersplitterung, and govern their own affairs in their own state. So if it was fine for Germans to form a national state in 1848, why not Czechs? The United States is a nation state, as is virtually every democracy. Why do we in the West often begrudge East Europeans their desire for life in national states? To come back to the issue of untranslatability, maybe unpronounceability as well, let us consider the word Reich. It is not empire, at least not precisely. The word Reich, the German word Reich, tended to be more homogenizing and was situated where North Americans least expect empire, not across oceans and continents, but at the heart of Europe, where the colonial peoples appear to be of the same culture as the colonizers. The ambitions of Reich to dominate were registered not in far-flung outposts, but in places we tend not to recognize as colonies at all, like Prague. What is telling about Julius Ficker and his invocation of a sacred imperial tradition going back to the Middle Ages is that he was not a right-winger. He was not a nasty nationalist, not a conservative. In fact, he was a man of reason, a liberal. Yet he stated clearly the basic expectations invoked by the word Reich, rule not just of many human beings, but of many peoples. Finally, neither the Habsburg Reich project nor the more assertive Prussian version proved stable, ultimately moving into the 20th century. Very briefly, the very word Reich made stability perhaps impossible as a democracy. Among Germans, the Great German or Großdeutsch idea was popular far beyond the so-called Pan-Germans. And after the collapse of the Habsburg and Prussian German empires in 1918, populations of both entities, of both of these territories, wanted unity as a Reich, including, of course, Bismarck's old Kaiserreich, but also the Austrian as well as Bohemian lands. The victorious allies at Paris in 1919 did not permit this to happen, and Austria was forced to become an independent state, a republic of one people. Nevertheless, the parliamentarians further north who drafted a constitution for Germany in Weimar, a state that we call the Weimar Republic, called their state, do you know what they called it, the Weimar Republic, officially? Any stamp collectors here? Das Deutsche Reich. The Weimar Republic officially was not a republic, it was an empire. It turned out that this democracy could not live up to the standards of an empire. Ultimately, there is no liberal empire. And when after 1933, a chancellor from Austria promised to make a Reich, including most of the old empire's territory, many, if not most, Austrian and Bohemian Germans found this idea irresistible, and that included many on the left, many social democrats. Virtually everyone who embraced the Reich term after the decline of the old empire in 1806 was playing with fire. Prince Metternich, for all the criticism that I have heaped upon this poor gentleman, is among the few who understood this fact. And maybe it's no coincidence that only in 1945, with the Reich dismembered, dead, and soon buried, that Austro-Germans could finally be what they are now, simply Austrians, with the aspiration of governing themselves, but not neighboring peoples, not the Nachbarvölker. So with that, I conclude my remarks. Thank you very much for your attention.